Okay, hello everyone and good morning. This is a bit of a new model, just as a one-off because I'm traveling this week. So this will be the final share on the sugya, the short sugya on Mem Daled on Dalef, of Mosar SheBaNer, the chaburah also, and Rabbizobin Mate. And I just want to finish off the sugya, and then I will send sources for us starting the next sugya when we switch to the other perek and go forward with Muktza through that route. So we were looking at this is just a collation of as many of the different sources I could find, and we were showing them in the postscript that explain what the Muktza is that we're dealing with over here and try and understand it. And just a reminder, we saw the view of the Rach, the Rabbi Zobin, the Rif, the Rambam, either their explanation of the Gemara or their Ges of the Gemara, in which they understand that the Mosar SheBaNer, the leftover oil, the Isra is his stapik, one's not allowed to use. And the Ron explains that since the oil, one can't help oneself use up the oil, take oil out of the lamp to use on Shabbos, because that would be removing fuel and therefore extinguishing, causing the flame to be extinguished, and therefore it's also to do so. Therefore, the oil is Muktza. There's a second stage halacha which now clicks in that the oil is Muktza with respect to use. So it's a new type of Muktza in a sense, a Muktza with respect not to tiltul, to movement, but with respect to use. And this Muktza remains even once the generator of the Muktza, which was the original Issa of Mechaber, has disappeared. Then we saw I mentioned the post can talk about Muktza because of Huktzah Mitzvaso, which Tosfos references on the Mishnah, which we looked at. So there would also be Huktzah Mitzvaso, that's the second Muktza that's floating around. And Tosfos said this is a Muktza that even HaShemen is Moida to. And the Huktzah Mitzvaso would only refer to a ner, which is the national mitzvah, wouldn't refer to stam, a candle or light on Shabbos. And on the other hand, the Muktza of Shema Yitabeh that's generated, but you can't use the oil because it would cause indirect removal of fuel and indirect kibbutz, extinguishing of the flame. That wouldn't apply in Yom Tov. So there's there's differences between the two. So that was the first point that we made in the previous Shiurim. We then had a brief discussion about, now that I'm oscillate stopik, I can't use the oil as explained by the Ran. Why wouldn't there also be a full Issa Muktza? Because if I can't use the oil, it's now useless. Once it's useless, it should become fully Muktza. And we said that there's room to debate this point, the post going to discuss it. On the one hand, if you can't use it, then it's useless. On the other hand, while it's burning, you can be metaltel because it's being used as a candle, as a flame, as a light, and all else being equal, if there are no other prohibitions in place, we're ignoring shalhaves and the flame itself and bosses, just for this reason alone, you would be allowed to move it from place to place in order to have light in different rooms. So the suggestion that because it's also his stapik, one can't use up the oil, therefore it should become fully muktzah, even with respect to tiltul, wouldn't make sense while the flame is burning. Because while the flame is burning, I ought to be allowed to move it around if I'm ignoring other forms of Muktza, because why can't I move it from room to room in order to get the light? Paradoxically, once the flame goes out, if the Muktza lingers of the oscillate stapik, I'm not allowed to use the oil, then there should be the additional Muktza, because now it is indeed completely useless. I can't use the oil for anointing myself or for salad dressing, and I can't use the oil for flame because the oil's gone out. So at that point, indeed, it ought seemingly to become completely Muktza, even with respect to tiltul, because even though the initial Muktza was with respect to using the oil, now that I can't use the oil for anything, the Issa tiltul would also click in. The next thing we began thinking about is why do we need these explanations of Muktza mitzvah or Huktzah mitzvaso, or like the Ran, because also this stapik, because Shema Yechabe, maybe because it would be kibbutz, it would be extinguishing it by helping yourself to the oil. What about the Gemara later on, which says that there's an Issa of bosses? The Gemara, as we saw, I think we have it in the source sheets in Mem Zayin on Dalef. The Gemara says Hanach, HaShemen, Psila and Ner, that they are all bosses to the flame, and therefore they're Muktza. Now, as I discussed, it's not entirely clear what we mean by this bosses. I mean, first of all, why is the Shalhaves itself Muktza? So there's a number of explanations given, either because the normal way is not to move a flame itself, or because there's ein bo mamish, it's not a keli, there's a nothingness to the flame, or because it's just not the normal way to move it, because we don't normally touch flames, and that's what makes it Muktza. So either way, the flame is Muktza, and there would be subtle distinctions in Halacha, or not so subtle distinctions, as to what type of Muktza it would be and how this would be applied to modern day electrical appliances. But either way, the flame itself, I understand, is Muktza. But what about the bosses? What makes the rest of it a bosses? I mean, the whole idea of bosses to a flame is an interesting idea. Maybe the psila, the wick, is the sort of base on which the flame is sitting. But the rest of and maybe even the lamp, you could say, is a bosses because it's all one entity. But the oil, what has a flame at one end of the oil got to do with the Muktza of the oil at the other end of the flame? How is that connected to the flame? It's not sitting on top of it. It's not one entity. And on the contrary, if I was allowed to help myself to the oil, then the oil at the other end of the flame could be taken without directly affecting the flame, without moving the flame, and would be a separate entity. It's like lots of bits of material disconnected, because I can help myself spoon out the liquid from one end of the lamp without affecting the liquid on the other end of the lamp. So this is a conceptual difficulty in the Gemara saying it's bosses. And arguably, maybe it only becomes a bosses after the svara of the Ram. Now that the Ram has told us that it's also this stapek, that I'm not allowed to help myself to the oil. So since I'm not allowed to help myself to the oil, all the oil is dedicated, is set aside to be drawn into the wick. And therefore it's a type of bosses in the sense that it's all there to support the wick, to support the flame, to be drawn into the wick, because it's also this stapek. But were it to be the case that it would be mutter this topic, I would be allowed to help myself to the oil, then the oil on the other end of the pool doesn't yet have a connection to the flame, and therefore wouldn't be a bosses. So this is a svara that we can put forward. I'm not convinced it fits in the language of the Ram. That's something for you to have a look at and to make your own decision. But either way, it seems like a good svara, that when the Gemara says it's a bosses, the oil is a bosses, the oil only becomes a bosses because of something that precedes it, which is that all the oil is Muktza and can't be used anything else other than for feeding the flame. And that was I think the final point that we made in the last Shiur on the idea of the Muktza that's floating around over here. Incidentally, if we're talking about bosses, there's something else that we just need to consider for a few moments. We discussed in Hilchos bosses and in the rules of Migoid Iskatsoi Ben Shmoshes, that something that is Muktza Ben Shmoshes determines the Muktza status for the whole of Shabbos, because the concept of Muktza is whether it's Muchan, whether it's prepared or omeid, set aside or by default set for use on Shabbos, and Ben Shmoshes determines the nature of the rest of Shabbos. We discussed, again, if you remember, in the earlier sugyos on Daf Mem Gimel Omud on Daf Mem Gimel Omud Aleph, we discussed what would happen with respect to bosses. We saw the view of the Balamor, which is the minority opinion, that it doesn't remain Muktza for the whole of Shabbos. But more significantly, we saw the view of Rabbi Zobin, which is more of a widely quoted opinion amongst the Rishonim, that if something is destined to stop being a bosses as Shabbos goes on, so for example, you're planning to remove it, then it wouldn't become a bosses if you know it's going to cease to be a bosses, or if there's a fragility about the relationship. So if you remember, we spoke about the chickens hopping on and off the flame, and then later we discussed the case of the mace, the dead body, that's mutal on the middle where you're planning to unroll it, and we discussed the idea of shochach if you weren't planning to leave something there the whole of Shabbos. So in brief, the view of Tosfos, the view of Rabbi Zobin, is something which is inevitably going to be removed, or the plan is to remove it. You're not setting aside the object upon it which it rests to permanently be a bosses, then it would cease to be Muktza. So again, if I have a bowl and the bowl is not Muktza, it's okay, and inside the bowl I place something of Muktza, but my intention or the inevitable consequences that the object placed inside it will cease to be Muktza or will cease to sit in the bowl, then the bowl wouldn't become a bosses. Now, based on that, there's another question we can think over here, because the flame is going to go out at some point, unless the flame is long enough to last the whole of Shabbos. In which case, why would the lantern, let's say, be a bosses for the flame? Surely at some point the flame will go out, at which point the Muktza entity, which is the flame, will cease to be sitting on top of the lantern, and therefore it's difficult to understand why it would be bosses. Now, the Rashba, again, I haven't put the sources here because this is later on. This is a Rashba in Memvavim base discusses and raises this question. And all he points out is, in other words, why should the lamp, the lantern, the keli be a bosses for the flame? If the flame is inevitably going to go out, according to Rabbi Zobin, it will cease to be Muktza at that point, and we wouldn't say migoid is katsoi. And all he points out is that this would help perhaps with respect to the lantern. However, with respect to the oil, all the oil is going to be used up in burning the flame. The flame will go out when it runs out of oil. I mean, in this case, there's Mosar HaShemen. For some reason, the flame went out early. But the plan is that the flame will remain alive until all the oil is used up. So with respect to the oil, it is permanently a bosses to the flame, because there will be no point at which the flame will cease to sit on top of the oil, because by the time the flame goes out, the oil will normally have ceased to exist. But with respect to the lantern, just something's fired away, we need to consider, why would the lantern be a bosses to the flame? After all, the oil and the flame will cease to be there at some stage of a Shabbos. That's inevitably what's going to happen. And therefore, according to Rabbi Zobin, surely it shouldn't remain Muktza the whole of Shabbos. So this is just another point to consider with respect to the Muktza of bosses. So to summarize, we've said so far, there's a Muktza of Nistapek, as the Ran explains, not to use up the oil, since it would be prohibited to use up the oil because it would be putting the flame out. Therefore, any leftover oil remains Muktza. There's the Muktza of mitzvah, and then there's the Muktza of bosses. And we had a discussion about how bosses make sense in this context, and whether there's an issue with the fact that the flame will go out and therefore it should cease to be a bosses. These are three sorts of muktzah that we've spoken about so far. And now on to the fourth consideration that's brought in. Okay, so the final suggestion of muktzah that I want to look at is based on a debate around Dover She'einu Miskavin. So we did touch on this earlier in Masechet Shabbat, but just to remind you, we're not going to go into the whole debate. But the basic question is whether an unintended side consequence that occurs when I do something is also on Shabbos that needs to be in HaTorah. So, for example, the classic example is I'm dragging a stool along the ground and creating furrows in the ground, which could be useful for ploughing or the like, whether I have to be concerned about the incidental side effects of my action. Either way, it remains a machlokas tanoim. So there is a possibility that the consequence, inevitable or non-inevitable, depends on situation, so on, of an action is also min haTorah, midiraisa on Shabbos. So the Rashba in Beit Sod Beis links this to whether I'm allowed to move a candle on Shabbos. By the way, I misquoted the source of the Rashba just a moment ago when I said the Rashba in Memvov. So Rashba in Beit Sod Beis that discusses this idea of bosses that we just referenced previously. The Rashba there in Beit also discusses something else. And the Rashba says that the reason why a lantern is muktzah on Shabbos is because as I move a lantern around, there's a good probability that I would extinguish the flame. If there will be the air, the motion of air as I move it around, the relative motion of air, and that would extinguish the flame. And this would be a Dover She'einu Miskavin. It's true, it's an unintended side consequence that I have no interest in. Nonetheless, I shouldn't move the flame because of this possible unintended side consequence. So says the Rashba. And Rashba says explicitly that this is the reason why it would be muktzah. Because since I can't move it, and by the way, now we're talking about movements, we're talking about tiltul, classic muktzah movement, therefore says the Rashba, it would be muktzah on, it would be forbidden to move on Shabbos, and therefore even when the flame goes out, since I wasn't allowed to move it out at the beginning of Shabbos, it would remain muktzah the whole of Shabbos. So this is a fourth reason for muktzah floating around over here, the view of the Rashba, because of the risk of it being extinguished if I move it around, and therefore I'm not allowed to move it around, even if that causes it, even after it goes out when it's no longer relevant, the risk of kiboy, because it's become muktzah, migud iskatzoi ben hashmashas. This is the fourth opinion. There are two quibbles on this svara of the Rashba, which I'll just briefly share with you. The first quibble is, it's interesting, again, just to sort of bring out the nuance at this point. The logic of muktzah is that something is removed from functionality. It's not omeid, it's not set aside for use, and that's why it's muktzah, it's not muchen. So the Chazon Ish asks in this Rashba, and he says, it's true I can't move it around, but normally my inability to move something around or to use it makes it muktzah, because that makes it non-functional, dysfunctional. Here, the inability to move it around is because of its very functionality. Its functionality as a lamp is to a degree contradicted by moving it around, which would extinguish the flame. So he says it doesn't cease to be a usable keli because I can't move it around. Let's say I have a forbidden object. So I have a hammer. So the hammer is to a degree muktzah on Shabbos because it can't be used for its core functionality. Over here, or let's have a valuable object, a phone. So a phone is muktzah because I can't use it for its core functionality, and maybe even gets a higher degree muktzah because what we call muktzah machmas and case, because I wouldn't even use it for any other use, because the muktzah is contradicting its use. I can't use it as a hammer, I can't use it as a phone. Here, the inability to move the lantern around isn't contradicting its use. Adarabba, on the contrary, its very use is to burn and to give out light, and that is what it's doing. The moving it around might contradict its use. It limits its use that I can't move it around because I can have it light in room A and I can't move it to room B. That's true. But on the other hand, the inability to move it around doesn't make it cease to be a kli or diminish its kaliness. Now, hammer that can't be used, its kaliness is diminished, and if it gets a low level of muktzah, it still remains somewhat of a kli because I could still use it as a coconut cracker. The phone, that is, its use is diminished, becomes even less of a keli because I wouldn't use it for anything else. There is no other use of this muktza machmas, so in case it's a valuable object, and therefore I wouldn't use it for anything else. But the lamp, the core use doesn't get contradicted. I can't move it from room to room. There's a slight diminishing of the use, but it remains a keli, it remains a utensil used for human needs. Therefore, why should it become muktzah? I can't move it around, but as soon as I am able to move it around, because the risk of the prohibition of kibbutz ceases, why shouldn't it be a full kli? Surely the whole logic of muktzah doesn't make sense in this case. So this is a very, very important point of the Chazon Ish, and a very important question on the logic of the Rashba that really needs consideration. One can say a variant or a nuance of this, which is that the external prohibition of moving it around, it's a little bit difficult to understand why the external prohibition should make it muktzah. I can't move around. That's a technical thing that's impeding it. You know, almost as if something is temporarily locked in a box. But as soon as I know that later on Shabbos I'll get the keys, then I will be able to. So this is an external issa which is manifesting, imposing, and limiting my ability to move it around. But why should it become muktzah? As soon as the external issa is removed, surely the muktzah should cease. Again, this is different to regular muktza machmas issa or kisha melachot issa. A hammer, it's true, it's an external issa, hilchos Shabbos, that means that I can't use it, but that's diminishing its core use. It can't be used as a hammer because of the issa. Over here, it's just an external issa that stops me moving it around. With a hammer, I can't use it, therefore it becomes osir in tiltul and movement. Over here, I can use it, it's just I can't move it around. Where do we get the concept of muktzah? In what way does this make it not muchal? So these are questions that one could ask on the view of the Rashba that says this is a muktza. Okay, just to summarize either way, and with this we'll bring a conclusion to this part of the sugya, and we arrive at the Mishnah. The first explanation is, as the Ran says, because of the issa of this stapik and HaShemen, I can't use up the oil, and therefore I just can't use it. The second explanation is we can consider a second element to consider around that is whether because I can't use it, I also wouldn't be able to move it. A third thing to think about is muktza machmas with a nair that's a nair of mitzvah. I wouldn't be allowed to use it for mitzvah, and there's enough committed distinctions between these reasons. If it's not a nair shel mitzvah, if it's on Yom Tov, when I can use up the oil. And then we spoke about bosses, whether it's muktza because there's bosses, as per the Gemara later on. And finally, the Rashba, who says that because I can't move it out because of the risk of moving it and extinguishing it, that would make it muktza. And with that, we draw a close to our sugya, to the discussions around muktza. Other than just to mention very briefly in practical halacha, it seems that these reasons shouldn't apply with respect to filament and electric heaters, whether filament light bulbs or heaters where glowing metal causes the heat, which have the status of a flame. There's no risk of extinguishing the flame. There's no oil source that's being used up. It's not hukta lemitzvosoi. It's not. There's no aimbo mamish. There's no flame there, which doesn't have a mamoshus. There's just a glowing ember. It's izakeli. It's an implement that's used for human use. And it is moved around. The Rashba Torah, it's not the Ritva Torah, it's not normally moves around, wouldn't apply. And therefore, even with filament lights, there's a good argument to say that this muktza wouldn't apply. Nonetheless, the poskim of Moshe were a little bit hesitant about this, given that there's a multiplicity of reasons for muktza, and not completely clear that this wouldn't apply to filament lights. When it comes to non-filament sources of light, like LED and fluorescence and so on, there everyone agrees that the prohibition of shalhevis does not apply because there's no flame at all, and therefore we don't have to extend it that far. And therefore the consensus of almost all poskim is that electrical items in and of themselves are not muktza. They may happen to be muktza if their use is muktza like a phone, but if their use isn't muktza like a light or a heater, they wouldn't be muktza. And this is the halacha l'maisa that emerges from our sugya of shalheves. So again, by the time you see this, I will be in Eretz Yisrael. I wish you a good day, and Tuesday, Emir Hashem will start the next sugya, and I'll be sending sources. Be well.